On Christmas Eve, my father insists a dangerous ice storm has made travel impossible and tells me to stay home. Something about his explanation feels wrong, but I don't argue. Later that evening, one photograph reveals a devastating truth. I was never being protected, I was being excluded. At exactly 2:17 p.m. on Christmas Eve, my phone lit up with my father's name. I looked at the screen for 2 rings before answering. Outside my apartment window, pale winter sunlight reflected across parked cars, and a light breeze nudged the bare branches of the maple tree beside the building. Nothing about the afternoon suggested danger. "Hey, Dad." His voice arrived without a greeting. "Don't leave your apartment." There was no hesitation. No warmth. Just an order. "The highways are closing. Ice storm. State police are telling everyone to stay home." I walked toward the window and watched a delivery driver unload boxes without slipping once. I hadn't heard anything about a storm. "It's moving faster than they predicted," he replied. "The roads are already becoming impossible." I stayed quiet. Silence had become one of my strongest habits. Growing up, I learned that asking too many questions turned every conversation into a courtroom where I was always guilty before evidence existed. "I'll be fine," I finally said. "No," he answered sharply. "You're not driving anywhere today." His certainty sounded rehearsed. Then came the sentence that lingered longer than anything else. "Your grandmother wanted to discuss that $487,500 trust distribution, but it can wait until after the holidays." The amount caught my attention immediately. Grandma never discussed financial matters casually. She believed important conversations happen face to face, around a dinner table, where every person involved could ask questions before signing anything. For Dad to dismiss it so easily felt unusual. "I understand," I replied. "Good." He sounded relieved. Almost too relieved. "We'll figure everything out next week." The call ended. I lowered my phone without moving. The apartment felt strangely still. Fresh coffee cooled beside me, filling the room with a rich aroma that suddenly seemed stronger than before. My heating vent hummed softly beneath the window while sunlight continued pouring across perfectly dry pavement outside. Nothing matched the emergency I had just been warned about. I opened my weather application. 43 degrees. Clear skies. 5% chance of precipitation. No winter storm warning. No travel advisory. No highway closure. I checked the state transportation website. Traffic flowed normally across every interstate connecting my city to my parents' neighborhood. Interesting. Maybe forecasts had changed. Maybe Dad had seen something I hadn't. Instead of assuming he lied, I opened 3 separate weather services. Every forecast agreed. Cold. Sunny. Calm. No ice. No storm. No emergency. I leaned against the kitchen counter and folded my arms. Something wasn't right. Yet I didn't call him back. People often mistake silence for weakness. In reality, silence creates space for patterns to reveal themselves. If someone is lying, they usually continue talking until the truth finds them. So I waited. They had absolutely no idea that waiting had become one of my greatest strengths. Around 3:45 p.m., my mother sent a brief text. "Stay safe, sweetheart. Christmas can wait." No heart emoji. No offer to video chat. No disappointment that we wouldn't spend the holiday together. Just another confirmation of Dad's story. Or so it appeared. I responded with a simple, "Love you. Stay warm." Nothing more. By early evening, Christmas music drifted softly from neighboring apartments. Children laughed in the courtyard. Someone grilled food on a balcony despite the chilly air. The world outside looked almost festive. Certainly not frozen. I wrapped myself in a blanket and tried reading a book, but my attention kept returning to my phone. Every notification made me glance down. Every vibration carried possibility. By 7:58 p.m., curiosity replaced disappointment. I opened social media. Friends posted family dinners, church services, matching pajamas, smiling grandparents. Everything looked ordinary. Then at 8:41 p.m., I saw my cousin's newest post. A family photograph. The caption simply read, "Another perfect Christmas together." My thumb froze above the screen. The dining room looked exactly as I remembered. Grandma sat at the center of the table. My parents smiled beside her. My younger sister leaned comfortably against Dad's shoulder. A long table overflowed with candles, roasted turkey, sweet potatoes, cornbread, pies, and crystal glasses reflecting warm golden light. Everyone looked relaxed, comfortable, happy. There wasn't a trace of panic. No one looked stranded. No one looked worried about dangerous highways. I checked the upload time. 37 minutes earlier. Then I counted the chairs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Every seat was occupied, except mine. The family photograph stayed on my screen long after the warmth left my coffee. I didn't zoom in because I wanted to torture myself. I zoomed in because details always mattered. Years of working as a corporate crisis manager had taught me that people rarely hid the truth perfectly. They left fingerprints in conversations, timestamps on photographs, and tiny inconsistencies that eventually connected into something undeniable. Christmas Eve was no different. The dining room windows reflected clear skies. The driveway outside my parents' house looked dry. The front porch lights glowed over bare concrete without a trace of snow or ice. There had never been a weather emergency. There had only been me. I placed my phone on the kitchen counter and closed my eyes for a moment. The silence inside my apartment felt heavier than before, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and distant laughter drifting through the hallway. Oddly enough, I wasn't surprised. Disappointed, yes. Heartbroken, absolutely. Surprised? Not anymore. When I was growing up, my father loved introducing my younger sister, Vanessa, before anyone else. "This is my beautiful girl," he would say with unmistakable pride. Then, almost as an afterthought, he would gesture toward me. "And this is Naomi. She's the smart one." People laughed politely. I learned to smile politely. No one noticed how differently those introductions landed. Vanessa inherited our mother's lighter complexion, soft curls, and effortless charm. Family members constantly admired her beauty before asking about anything else. I inherited my grandmother's deep brown skin, quiet temperament, and stubborn determination. Some relatives called my complexion strong. Others said I was pretty in my own way. Children hear everything, even when adults pretend they don't. By high school, I understood something no child should ever have to learn. Beauty earned applause. Achievement earned silence. When I graduated at the top of my class, my father shook my hand. When Vanessa won a local beauty competition 6 months later, he rented an entire ballroom for the celebration. Nobody called it favoritism. They called it supporting different personalities. My mother repeated the same sentence whenever I looked hurt. Keeping peace is more important than being right. At first, I believed her. Later, I realized keeping peace always seemed to require one person. Me. When I accepted a position as a corporate crisis manager, I thought things might finally change. My work involved helping companies survive lawsuits, executive scandals, regulatory investigations, and financial emergencies. I enjoyed solving impossible problems while everyone else panicked. Dad rarely mentioned it. Whenever someone asked about my career, he smiled politely. "Naomi works in business." That was usually the end of the conversation. If they asked about Vanessa, his entire posture changed. "Our Vanessa has such an exciting social life. She's always traveling with influential people. Influential. That word mattered more to him than successful. He admired appearances almost as much as results. Sometimes more. One person encouraged that obsession better than anyone. Richard Whitmore. Richard had been around our family for nearly 15 years. Tall. Perfect suits. Perfect smile. Perfect manners. A wealthy white financial advisor who somehow became one of my father's closest friends. Dad treated his opinions like scripture. If Richard complimented someone's investment strategy, Dad repeated it for weeks. If Richard criticized someone, Dad quietly adopted the same opinion, including opinions about me. I remembered one dinner 2 years earlier. Richard leaned back in his chair and smiled. So, Naomi, you still solve other people's problems for a living? I help companies manage risk. He chuckled. Sounds like fancy paperwork. Dad laughed louder than anyone else. Vanessa joined in. I smiled. People often confuse calmness with agreement. They had absolutely no idea I had just finished leading a corporate restructuring worth over $90 million. Explaining that wouldn't have changed anything. Some people don't ignore your accomplishments because they misunderstand them. They ignore them because acknowledging them threatens the story they've already written about you. Over the next hour, I stopped replaying memories and started collecting facts. I downloaded weather reports from Christmas Eve. I saved screenshots of radar images. I archived my father's call log showing the exact time he warned me not to travel. Then I captured my cousin's photograph before anyone could delete it. Timestamp included. I created a digital folder, then another, then a timeline. Years of crisis management had conditioned me to preserve evidence before asking questions. Evidence survives emotion. Emotion rarely survives denial. As I reviewed everything, another thought settled quietly into place. The trust. Dad hadn't casually mentioned Grandma's $487,500 distribution. He had volunteered that information. Why? He could have simply said Christmas dinner was canceled. Instead, he specifically reminded me that Grandma wanted to discuss financial matters. That detail refused to leave my mind. What if Christmas dinner wasn't the real event? What if dinner was only the excuse? What if someone needed me absent for something happening before or after the meal? A signature. A document. A vote. Something requiring every beneficiary except one. Me. The possibility tightened my chest far more than the family photograph ever had. I looked once more at the smiling faces gathered around Grandma's table. They thought they were protecting a secret. What they didn't know is that every lie leaves a paper trail. And I had built an entire career following those trails. Just as I reached for another folder, my phone rang. The caller ID stopped me cold. Harold Bennett. My grandfather's attorney. I answered immediately. His steady voice carried none of the holiday warmth I expected. Naomi, he said quietly, why weren't you at the reading? The next morning, I arrived at Harold Bennett's law office 10 minutes early. The building stood exactly where it had for decades, tucked between a historic bank and a quiet bookstore downtown. Frost clung to the edges of the sidewalks, and the brass lettering on the office door caught the pale winter sunlight. Inside, everything smelled faintly of polished oak, old paper, and fresh coffee. Harold greeted me with the same calm expression I remembered from my grandfather's business meetings. I'm glad you came, Naomi. I came because you asked me why I wasn't at the reading, I replied. He studied me for a moment before closing the office door behind us. I expected to see you yesterday. My father told me Christmas dinner was canceled because of an ice storm. Harold's eyebrows rose. I drove to your grandparents' home myself, he said quietly. The roads were perfectly clear. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Sometimes silence says more than outrage ever could. Harold crossed to a large mahogany cabinet and unlocked the bottom drawer with a small brass key. From inside, he removed a thick sealed envelope and a black flash drive. He placed both carefully on the conference table. Your grandfather left very specific instructions. I looked at the envelope without touching it. He told me these materials were only to be released if one condition was met. What condition? Harold folded his hands. If you were ever intentionally excluded from a significant family gathering. A chill spread through me that had nothing to do with the December air. He believed someone would eventually try to remove you from an important decision. I stared at the envelope, hearing my grandfather's steady voice in my memory. Never confuse patience with surrender, Naomi. Harold slid the documents toward me. He trusted your judgment. Breaking the seal felt strangely ceremonial. Inside were certified legal documents, property records, trust amendments, and a letter written in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. My fingers trembled slightly as I unfolded the first page. If you are reading this, someone has mistaken your kindness for weakness. I had to stop for a moment. The words blurred before coming back into focus. Harold remained silent, allowing me to continue. The flash drive contained digital copies of decades of financial records, valuation reports, board resolutions, and correspondence connected to our family's investment company. Several files were highlighted. I opened the first. A commercial property transferred years earlier had been assigned a value dramatically below its independent appraisal. The next document revealed another transaction. Then another. Each one shifted ownership or control in ways that benefited outside interests while reducing the value of assets intended to remain within our family's estate. The pattern became impossible to ignore. None of the transactions looked accidental. They're structured to appear legitimate, I said quietly. Harold nodded. That's why your grandfather hired independent reviews before his health declined. Another folder contained communications involving Richard Whitmore, the polished financial advisor my father admired so completely. The same man who had mocked my career across countless family dinners. His name appeared repeatedly alongside proposed restructurings, revised valuations, and recommendations affecting family-owned holdings. Nothing in front of me proved criminal conduct on its own. But together, the documents raised serious questions that demanded answers. My grandfather had clearly suspected that influence, not open theft, posed the greatest risk to everything he had built. He didn't want these concerns ignored after he was gone, Harold said. So he trusted me. He trusted the one person he believed would look beyond emotion. I closed the folder carefully. For years I had believed I was fighting to earn a permanent place inside my family. Now I understood something far more painful. My grandfather had already given me one. He simply knew others might try to erase it. That evening I returned home carrying the sealed files. The apartment felt unusually quiet. I set the envelope on the dining table and finally allowed every emotion I had held back to surface. Not anger. Not rage. Grief. I grieved the years spent seeking approval that had always come with conditions. I grieved every holiday where acceptance depended on staying silent. Most of all, I grieved knowing my grandfather had anticipated this betrayal long before I had. When the tears finally stopped, something inside me settled. The woman who wanted to be chosen by her family quietly disappeared. In her place stood someone with a different purpose. I would no longer compete for love that had to be earned. I would protect the legacy that had already been entrusted to me. The next morning, I reviewed Harold's final recommendation. One authorization would preserve key records and formally begin an independent legal review. I read every line twice. Then I picked up the pen. Without hesitation, I signed it. And I told no one. Chapter 4. They thought I was defeated. They celebrated my silence as if it were surrender. That was their first mistake. 3 days after Christmas, my father called while I was reviewing the documents Harold Bennett had entrusted to me. His voice carried the relaxed confidence of someone convinced the hardest part was already behind him. "I'm glad you finally accepted that some things are bigger than your feelings," he said. I looked through my office window at the city skyline without answering immediately. "I never said I was upset." "No," he replied with a chuckle. "You finally learned when to stay out of family business." Family business. The phrase lingered in my thoughts long after the call ended. What he didn't know was that I was already studying every page of that business. Every signature. Every transfer. Every amendment. They thought I had accepted being excluded from Christmas dinner. In reality, I had accepted something entirely different. I had accepted that the truth deserved protection more than family pride. That single realization changed every decision I made afterward. I began each morning at exactly 6:30 a.m. with a fresh timeline spread across my conference table. Printed bank statements rested beside trust amendments, property appraisals, corporate filings, and handwritten notes from my grandfather. Every document fit somewhere. Every inconsistency led somewhere. Years spent managing corporate crises had taught me one lesson above all others. Chaos always leaves a pattern. You simply have to stop reacting emotionally long enough to see it. The more I organized the records, the clearer the picture became. Several commercial properties had been transferred between related companies at values significantly below independent appraisals. Ownership percentages shifted quietly over several years. Small adjustments, almost invisible, until they were viewed together. Then they became impossible to ignore. I contacted an experienced forensic accounting firm that specialized in tracing complex financial transactions involving trusts and closely held businesses. Their engagement agreement protected attorney-client privilege and required complete confidentiality. Within 48 hours, they began reconstructing every transfer. Meanwhile, I worked with Harold to file notices preserving disputed trust assets until ownership questions could be resolved. The filings were routine, professional, entirely legal. No accusations. Only preservation. If someone later proved wrongdoing, the assets would still exist. If not, nothing would be lost. That was the beauty of strategy. It didn't require anger, only patience. While I quietly worked, my family continued believing nothing had changed. Vanessa made certain of that. She called one afternoon while I was reviewing valuation reports. "I heard you've been buried in paperwork again." "I've been busy." She laughed softly. "You've always been busy." I smiled to myself. "So have you. Not like you. Executives don't actually build anything. You people just push paperwork around while everyone else lives." I let several seconds pass. Silence unsettles people who expect immediate defense. "You finished?" I asked. She sounded slightly irritated. "You always act like you're smarter than everyone." "I never said that." "You don't have to." The conversation ended shortly afterward. She believed she had won. What she didn't know was that the call itself reinforced a larger pattern I had documented for years. Consistent dismissal. Consistent exclusion. Consistent attempts to undermine my professional judgment. None of it proved financial misconduct, but it explained motive. A few days later, Richard Whitmore requested a meeting. He chose a private room inside an upscale downtown club where polished marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers overhead. Everything about the setting projected success, including him. Perfect navy suit, gold watch, confident smile. He greeted me as though we were old colleagues. "Naomi." "Richard. I've heard you've been asking questions." "I ask questions for a living." He smiled politely. "Sometimes questions become expensive." I remained quiet. He leaned forward. "You seem intelligent enough to understand litigation." "I do." "Good." His smile widened. "Because if you interfere with legitimate business transactions, The lawsuits alone could bury you. His confidence filled the room. He expected fear. Instead, I reached for my glass of water, took one sip, set it back down. I appreciate the advice. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. I don't think you understand. I understand perfectly. No, you don't. He folded his hands. Your grandfather trusted professionals. I know. He trusted me. Again, I simply nodded. Richard mistook composure for uncertainty. People often do. They mistake calmness for weakness because they cannot imagine confidence that doesn't announce itself. When the meeting ended, he walked away believing he had intimidated me. He had absolutely no idea I had entered that room with every required legal authorization already in place. By the end of that week, additional preservation notices had been filed. Relevant financial institutions received formal requests to suspend disputed distributions pending review. Regulatory agencies were notified of potential irregularities requiring independent examination. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. Real investigations rarely look dramatic. They move quietly, methodically, exactly as they should. The forensic accountants continued tracing transactions. Harold coordinated with outside counsel. I reviewed every report before approving the next step. One discovery affected me more than any other. Several retirement funds belonging to elderly community investors had been placed into ventures connected to Richard's recommendations. They had trusted his reputation. Some invested savings accumulated over decades. Others depended upon those funds for medical expenses and retirement income. Whatever happened next would affect more than my family. That realization strengthened my resolve. This was no longer about Christmas, or favoritism, or proving my father wrong. It was about protecting people who had never realized they were in danger. Meanwhile, my father continued hosting dinners, attending charity events, and speaking proudly about Richard's financial brilliance. They believed everything remained under control. They believed I had finally accepted my place outside the family. They believed silence meant defeat. They had absolutely no idea every conversation, every email, every meeting, and every threat was becoming part of a growing body of evidence. The turning point arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Richard requested one final private meeting. This time, Harold attended as legal counsel. With everyone's knowledge and consent, the meeting was formally recorded. Richard appeared completely comfortable, almost amused. He spoke confidently about restructuring, influence, and necessary shortcuts taken to keep certain transactions from attracting unnecessary attention. Then he smiled. It was easier once Naomi wasn't around to question anything. The room became perfectly still. He continued talking, explaining, justifying, clarifying details no one had asked him to clarify. By the time he finally stopped speaking, he had unknowingly admitted everything that mattered. Chapter 5. The table turned the invitation arrived exactly 4 weeks after Christmas. The annual Bennett Community Foundation Gala had always been one of the city's most respected charity events. Judges, attorneys, business owners, bankers, university trustees, nonprofit directors, and civic leaders filled the guest list every year. My grandfather had helped establish the foundation decades earlier, and although he was gone, his name still carried quiet authority. This year, I intended to honor that legacy. Not with a speech, with the truth. When I stepped out of my car that evening, the winter air carried the scent of evergreen wreaths and polished cedar from the entrance decorations. Soft jazz drifted through the ballroom as guests exchanged greetings beneath crystal chandeliers. I wore a perfectly tailored deep emerald suit. It wasn't chosen because it was fashionable. It was chosen because it reminded me of armor. Months earlier, I would have dressed to earn approval. Tonight, I dressed to represent my grandfather's legacy. I walked into the ballroom without rushing. Every step felt deliberate. Across the room, I immediately spotted my parents standing beside Richard Whitmore and my younger sister, Vanessa. Richard smiled first. There she is. My father glanced toward me before shaking his head. I wasn't sure you'd actually come. I received an invitation. Vanessa folded her arms. I hope you're not planning to make another dramatic scene. I almost smiled. I've never made one. Richard laughed softly. No, Naomi. You prefer paperwork. His words drew polite chuckles from a few nearby guests. I've always admired your confidence, I replied. I've earned it. So you believe. His smile widened. I don't believe it. I know it. My father stepped closer. Richard has spent years helping this family. Whatever misunderstanding you have, tonight isn't the place. I agree. His expression relaxed. Then I added quietly, tonight is simply where everyone happens to be. He didn't understand what I meant. Neither did anyone else. The program began with speeches celebrating scholarship recipients and community investment initiatives. Applause echoed throughout the ballroom as donors were recognized one by one. I listened carefully. My grandfather's portrait stood near the stage. Looking at it steadied me. He had always believed integrity outlived reputation. Eventually, Richard approached the podium to introduce a new investment initiative connected to several charitable properties. As he spoke, I noticed two unfamiliar guests quietly enter through the rear doors. Dark suits. Professional expressions. They didn't mingle. They observed. Harold Bennett caught my eye from across the room and gave the smallest nod. Everything was ready. When Richard finished speaking, the moderator invited questions. I stood. Conversation stopped almost instantly. Richard smiled confidently. Naomi. Wonderful. Do you have something to add? I do. My father whispered sharply, sit down. I remained standing. Naomi, my mother pleaded softly, please don't embarrass the family. I turned toward her. I've spent my entire life protecting this family. Vanessa shook her head. No one is going to believe whatever story you've invented. I looked at her calmly. This isn't a story. Without another word, I walked toward the presentation table. From my leather portfolio, I removed a black flash drive. Then several certified documents bearing notarized seals. Finally, independent valuation reports and trust amendments. I placed everything neatly on the polished wood surface. Then I stepped back. I said nothing. Silence settled across the ballroom. The kind of silence that forces people to fill it. Richard couldn't resist. He laughed. Is this really what we've come to? No response. He picked up one of the reports. You don't understand how these transactions work. I remained silent. He continued. Some transfers had to be structured this way. Another pause. The ownership changes were temporary. His confidence never wavered. The properties couldn't stay under the original trust if we wanted flexibility. Every sentence sounded more defensive than the last. Someone near the front began taking notes. Richard didn't notice. He kept talking. The family agreed to most of it. Another pause. Besides, Naomi wasn't even involved when several of those documents were finalized. He stopped abruptly. Realization flickered across his face. Too late. The room had already heard him acknowledge that key decisions were made while I had been deliberately excluded. My father's complexion drained of color. He looked from Richard to the flash drive, then to Harold. Slowly, understanding settled over him. The fake weather emergency, the canceled Christmas dinner, the mysterious reading. It had never been about protecting me from dangerous roads. It had been about keeping me away from decisions I was entitled to witness. His shoulders sagged. For the first time in my life, he looked genuinely uncertain. My mother lowered her eyes. Vanessa's confidence disappeared. Richard attempted to recover. You've misunderstood everything. Harold finally spoke. No one has accused you of anything tonight. Richard answered too quickly. I can explain every transfer. Again, no one had asked him to. He had volunteered the statement himself. The investigators exchanged a brief glance. One of them stepped forward with calm professionalism. The ballroom had become completely silent. No music. No conversation. Only the faint sound of crystal glasses settling onto white linen tablecloths. The investigator looked around the room before speaking in an even voice. We're going to need everyone's phones. Chapter 6. Every lie has an invoice. The gala ended without applause. Conversations dissolved into whispers as investigators quietly escorted people into separate rooms. No one shouted. No one created a spectacle. The loudest sound that evening was the silence left behind after confidence disappeared. I watched from across the ballroom. Months earlier, I would have mistaken that silence for sadness. Now I recognized it for what it was. Accountability. Within days, formal civil investigations became public. Regulatory agencies opened reviews into transactions involving my grandfather's estate, several affiliated companies, and investment portfolios managed under Richard Whitmore's guidance. Financial institutions honored preservation orders that Harold Bennett and I had prepared weeks earlier, freezing disputed accounts until ownership could be determined. They had absolutely no idea those legal safeguards had been in place long before the charity gala. The confrontation had never been the beginning. It had only been the moment everyone else caught up. Richard's carefully polished reputation unraveled with remarkable speed. His own recorded statements became key evidence during multiple investigations. What he intended as confident explanations sounded very different when replayed in conference rooms filled with attorneys, auditors, and regulators. One by one, clients withdrew their accounts. Business partners issued public statements distancing themselves from him. Professional organizations suspended his memberships pending disciplinary proceedings. Then came the lawsuits. Some were filed by former clients. Others came from investors who discovered that property valuations and trust transfers had affected their retirement savings. The most difficult files to read belonged to elderly members of our community. Many had invested because they trusted my grandfather's name. They never realized someone else had been exploiting that trust. Those were the people I thought about most. Not Richard. Not my father. Not even myself. Justice mattered because innocent people had paid the highest price. Through court-supervised restitution and negotiated settlements, many families recovered significant portions of their investments. It did not erase years of uncertainty, but it gave them stability they feared had been lost forever. When the first restitution report arrived, I quietly folded the document and placed it beside my grandfather's photograph. That felt more meaningful than any courtroom victory. My father faced consequences of a different kind. Several civic organizations requested his resignation from leadership positions. Invitations that once arrived every month suddenly stopped. People who had admired his judgment now questioned how long he had ignored obvious warning signs. He called me twice. I let both calls go to voicemail. There was nothing left to argue about. The evidence spoke far more clearly than either of us ever could. My mother struggled in quieter ways. For years she believed preserving appearances meant preserving the family. Now she understood those were never the same thing. She wrote me a handwritten letter admitting that asking me to keep the peace had always meant asking me to carry burdens that belonged to everyone else. I appreciated her honesty. Forgiveness, however, required more than recognition. It required change. Whether she would find that change remained her decision. Vanessa's world shifted almost overnight. Luxury events stopped calling. Corporate sponsors quietly ended their relationships. The social circles she had worked so hard to enter suddenly became remarkably difficult to access. Status, I realized, is often rented rather than owned. When the applause disappears, so do many of the people clapping. She sent a brief message one evening. I never thought it would end like this. I read it. Then I locked my phone. Some conversations arrive years too late. Throughout the investigations, I continued working. My clients still needed guidance. Companies still faced crises. Life continued asking for discipline instead of distraction. That routine reminded me of something my grandfather often said. Character is revealed by what you build after disappointment. For the first time in years, I understood exactly what he meant. I had spent much of my life chasing acceptance from people determined to withhold it. Now I invested that same energy somewhere entirely different, protecting what deserved to survive. The legal process would continue for months. Appeals would be filed. Documents would be reviewed. More difficult conversations would follow. I knew that. Yet something inside me had already settled. I no longer measured success by whether my family finally recognized my worth. I measured it by whether I could look in the mirror without compromising my principles. That victory belonged to me alone. When Christmas arrived the following year, I woke before sunrise and opened my curtains. Fresh snow covered the neighborhood in quiet white. No emergency. No deception. Only peace. I brewed coffee, turned on soft jazz, and smiled as morning light filled my home. For the first time in my life, Christmas didn't feel like something I had to earn. It simply felt like home. Christmas finally felt peaceful for the first time in my life. Chapter 7. The seat they could never earn back the following Christmas arrived more quietly than any I could remember. At 4:30 p.m., I carried the last serving dish from my kitchen to the dining room table. The scent of roasted turkey, sweet potatoes, cinnamon, and fresh cornbread filled the house. Soft jazz played in the background while snow drifted slowly past the windows. For the first time in my life, I wasn't wondering who might reject me. I was surrounded by people who had already chosen me. Harold Bennett sat beside his wife, smiling as they shared stories about my grandfather. Two longtime family friends laughed with neighbors who had become part of my life after everything changed. A young couple whose retirement savings had been partially restored through the restitution process brought homemade pecan pie as a thank you gift. No one was there because of obligation. Everyone was there because of love. Before anyone sat down, I paused beside one empty chair. A year earlier, an empty chair had represented exclusion. Now it represented freedom. I left it empty on purpose. Not because I expected someone to arrive. Because I wanted a permanent reminder that I would never again beg for a place where I wasn't welcome. My grandfather used to say that every table tells a story. This one finally told mine. As dinner continued, conversation flowed easily. There were no hidden agendas, no careful performances, and no one measuring another person's worth by appearances or status. Peace, I realized, sounds different from silence. Peace carries laughter. Silence carries fear. Looking back over the past year, I understood how much had changed. Richard Whitmore's reputation never recovered. Investigations, civil judgments, and professional sanctions became part of the public record. The confidence that once impressed everyone ultimately collapsed beneath the weight of his own decisions. My father spent much of the year away from the organizations that had once celebrated him. Losing titles proved painful, but losing unquestioned respect changed him even more. Whether he truly learned from it was something only time could answer. My mother began volunteering with community organizations supported by my grandfather's foundation. She stopped talking about keeping the peace and started talking about accountability. It was a beginning, not an ending. Vanessa eventually discovered that admiration built on appearances fades quickly when character is tested. I hoped she would build something stronger, though that journey belonged to her. As for me, I stopped measuring my life against theirs. That was the greatest gift of all. My grandfather's charitable foundation expanded its work beyond anything he had imagined. New scholarships helped first-generation college students. Homeownership workshops opened doors for families who had been overlooked for generations. Financial education programs equipped young entrepreneurs with knowledge that could not be taken away. His legacy survived because it had always been about people, not possessions. Later that evening, after the dishes were cleared and the last guests had gone home, I stood alone beside the Christmas tree. The lights reflected softly against the windows. For a moment, I thought about the phone call that had changed everything. The fake weather emergency. The Christmas dinner I was never supposed to attend. At the time, it felt like the cruelest rejection of my life. Now I understood it differently. Had I been welcomed that night, I might never have uncovered the truth. I might never have protected my grandfather's legacy. I might have continued spending years trying to earn love that was always conditional. Sometimes the door that closes isn't your loss. It's your rescue. Your worth is not determined by who invites you to their table. Real family doesn't require you to shrink so someone else can feel taller. Healthy boundaries are not acts of revenge. They're acts of self-respect. You don't have to chase acceptance from people committed to misunderstanding you. Build a life where kindness is returned, integrity is protected, and love is freely given. One day you'll look around your own table and realize the people sitting there chose you just as faithfully as you chose them. And that's when you'll understand what I learned. The greatest revenge isn't making them watch you rise, it is realizing they no longer have a seat at your table.